Hey guys, it's Dani. Today we're gonna discuss about orchids that are blooming for the very first time and, well, they're not putting out much of a show. Now, we've talked about this before. Orchids which bloom for the very first time, aka younger orchids, might have wonky flowers or flowers with features missing. That is absolutely normal. It doesn't mean it happens to all orchids, but in some cases it can happen. It doesn't mean your orchid is faulty and it will forever bloom like that. But young orchids need a little bit of time to completely mature. Their internal chemical balance is not mature either. Their hormonal production is not yet stabilized. So there are cases in which our orchids, which just reached maturity, put on a not so spectacular show. And as it just so happens, I do have quite a few in my collection right now. I do have a few in my orchid archive as well. So I'm going to show you the orchids which were not very impressive at the beginning. With time, some of them became better and better, and also the ones that are just blooming for the very first time now. Now, even if it's not a rule that first-time bloomers will have lacking features, it is not uncommon. I was watching a webinar on the American Orchid Society's website, and the person holding the webinar, who was a hybridizer, they said that they usually wait for the third blooming of an orchid, particularly when they make a hybrid, when they cross to orchids, to have pretty much the final result. First-time blooming orchids, especially hybrids, might look a certain way, which might be good or might not be good, but it doesn't mean it will forever look like that. The second time the orchid will bloom, pretty much the flower will stabilize, but as you can see, they're waiting for the third time an orchid will bloom. I typically think the second blooming is about what it should be, but of course, if you're a hybridizer, you need to be sure of your work. Now, orchids which present poor first bloomings are not only direct hybrids or seedlings, they can be clones as well, because, as I was saying, it's about the internal chemistry, which can be weird both in the case of Mary clones and also in the case of seed-grown orchids. So if your orchid is not fragrant or is Pyloric even, or is lacking some features, don't despair, just wait for a second and a third blooming before you decide if the orchid is to your liking or not. So first-time bloomers, as I was saying, can actually have wonky flowers, and here is an example. This is my Paphiopedilum Philippinensis cross with Niveum, aka the Vipani. I was telling you that the formation that is growing from the crown doesn't really look like it's supposed to, but in an unexpected turn of events, the flower is not all that bad. It is pretty wonky, yes. You can see the pouch is pretty distorted, but the petals and sepals don't look all that bad. I'm not entirely sure about the color now. I'm happy that the pouch is white. However, I cannot be sure that this is the final result. You can also see that the flower spike is not rigid enough. It is actually very, very thin. I suspect it's not supposed to be that way, but I actually took a look inside, and let me just give you a close-up. Okay, boosted the exposure a bit. Do you see that the flower spike is actually sprouting from somewhere next to the leaf? Well, that's actually a sheath. Paphiopedilums produce a sort of a sheath in which the bud forms and then it sprouts. It looks like a leaf, but it's actually more of a sheath, and this orchid is producing that sheath, but this spike is not coming out of it. So I might still have a surprise from this guy. He might still decide to put out a new flower spike from where it's supposed to sprout. I'm hoping that will be the case, and I'm hoping this is just an additional flower spike, which of course shouldn't have happened. Paphiopedilum orchids don't produce multiple flower spikes from the same crown, at least the vast majority of them, the ones that I know about. Certainly this one was not supposed to do this, but yeah, not only the flower is, it's not decent, but gives me an idea of how the orchid will look like, but I might actually have the luck of getting a new flower spike. So you can see not only the flowers can be affected, but also the flower spikes. And if this orchid decides to produce 2 flower spikes instead of 1, well, that will be a pretty impressive first-time blooming, because I've never heard of a Paphiopedilum producing 2 spikes from the same crown. But we'll see what happens. First-time bloomers could also have lacking features, such as fragrance. This is my Miltonia Peter Comp. If you've watched yesterday's video, you know this orchid is supposed to be very fragrant, but mine is not. And this is because this is the very first blooming. It's not the very first time this orchid tries to create a flower spike. Last year I cut the flower spike before it even grew in any way because the orchid was really sick. This year though, the orchid has roots, she's in good condition, so I let her bloom and the blooms are wonderful. They're just not fragrant. And that doesn't mean that my individual is not fragrant necessarily. It could be, but it could also mean that in the future I will get a fragrance from this orchid. It's just the first time blooming quirk, let's say. This is not the only orchid that I've experienced with this feature. 5 years ago, the Rhynchorides Bangkok Sunset was blooming for the first time. I purchased it as a young orchid and I was so looking forward to the blooms, which not only were supposed to be really pretty but also very fragrant, and behold, a letdown. The flowers were really not colorful at all. They were very washed out actually, and there was almost no fragrance at all. So I was a little disappointed because the pictures on the internet were just so amazing. But of course I persevered, and the second blooming, which actually happened in the very same year, it was what I wanted to see. The blooms were beautifully colored, the colors were intense, and the fragrance was finally there. Ever since then, my orchid has bloomed beautifully every year. It has put on a great fragrance. It's not a very overwhelming fragrance, but it is very fresh and very noticeable right now. So in the case of the Bangkok Sunset, not only the flowers were not fragrant, but they were also very badly colored, which is another thing that can happen with first-time bloomers. Another thing that can happen to first-time bloomers is a very low flower count, and this is the case of my Sherry Baby. Now the plant itself I received from Karina, I think last year, at the beginning of last year maybe, and it was indeed a young orchid. It wasn't a seedling or anything, but the pseudobulbs were really tiny and it did fantastic. It grew and now she produced a flower spike from this bulb, which is considerably bigger than what she arrived with. She did really great. However, just look how many blooms she put on. This is not normal for an Oncidium Sherry Baby because they're known to produce this really beautiful cluster of blooms. I have 5 blooms, which is nowhere near the full potential of this orchid. Now the blooms are really pretty. I mean, that coloration is really nice. It looks a little bit like the tricolor, right? It's supposed to be the sweet fragrance though. I like it that it's not identical to the other Sherry Babies that I have. It smells so incredibly nice. I was actually on the terrace in front of my window working on something, and from time to time wafts of chocolate kept coming my way. It was beautiful, so she smells incredible. But you can see the flower count is just not right. And the bulb is great. I mean, it's big enough, and she is producing another new growth there. As you can see, she looks okay, she has roots, it's just the very first time it blooms. And that's something pretty common with first-time bloomers. The number of blooms is always a little bit less than what it should be, and this happens a lot with store-bought orchids as well. Sometimes we buy Dendrobium Phalaenopsis with 8 flowers, like the case of the Polar Fire, but the full potential is 16 flowers. That just has to do with the age of the orchid. And the better we care for it, of course, the more it will show its full potential. It happens with Phalaenopsis as well. You purchase a phal, again, 6-7 flowers, but then next year it produces this wonderful cascade of 20 flowers in your care. Yet again, it's the same thing. It has to do with the age of the orchid. You might know that Phalaenopsis, which you buy from the store, in most cases, they don't have remains of older flower spikes. And this is because typically, not all the times, but typically commercial nurseries don't wait around for a second blooming or a third blooming. If their orchid that they cared for 3 years, let's say, blooms for the very first time, it's ready to be sold. That's how it goes. It's an economic approach, nothing bad about it, but yeah, it just means that you can get a better display from your Phalaenopsis or your Dendrobium. And PS, since we're here, let's address a little bit the pitting on the leaves, which you can clearly see on my Oncidium cherry babies. Yet again, I was listening to a webinar, a Q&A webinar actually, a greenhouse discussion. Somebody asked the host, why do cherry babies get this pitting on the leaf, this dark spots, because they all do, and even before I got a cherry baby, I knew they were prone to having black dots on their leaves. And the answer they got had to do with temperature. The orchid expert was saying that cherry babies have a narrow range of temperatures in which they feel absolutely comfortable. If it's too cold or too hot, they will display this pitting on the leaf. Now, I'm not very prone to low temperatures here in my area. I'm prone to high temperatures, and I kind of agree with what they were saying, but in my case it's because of the heat. If you remember, I told you I put my cherry babies outside, but I brought them back because they didn't respond well, and the response was this pitting. I always get spots on cherry babies and twinkles and Soroanum, but this is a little extreme even for me. This happened while these orchids were outside, and in the back, the new growth, oops, sorry about that. So in the back, the new growth is not spotted, doesn't have anything. This is because it grew in the greenhouse or growth space. It will get some spots, but nothing like the ones you see on the mother, actually the previous pseudobulb. This happened outside, slightly extreme even for me, but I do see a pattern. The hotter I keep my cherry babies, and furthermore, if I let them dry out too much, they are prone to produce this pitting. I don't think it's something you should worry about because it doesn't extend. I never had further issues with it. I've always had pitting, less than this, but even this is pretty okay. I know some people suggest it could be a fungal infection or something. If it makes you feel better to treat it, why not? I never treat it. I personally don't believe it is a fungal infection. I believe it's something to do with the internal tissue. You know how calcium, or actually a deficiency of calcium, can look like rotting on Cattleyas? It's the same thing. It looks like a fungal infection, but actually dead tissue looks like a fungal infection as well because it's brown or black. So that's my 2 cents on the story. I also told you what the American orchid expert thinks, and from here on it's up to you to decide what you want to do about it. I personally don't do anything about this. I just try to maintain my cherry babies not in the heat. First-time bloomers not only can lack fragrance, but they can lack petals or sepals or even an entire lip. They actually bloom peloric. If you don't know what Pyloria means with orchids, check the description down below. I did make a video last year about it. It is basically a mutation of the flower, which in many cases can look really pretty, in some cases not so much. And first-time bloomers can actually display Pyloria, but it doesn't mean it will remain throughout the years. Pyloria itself is not a stable gene in many cases, unless we're dealing with a clone. If we're dealing with a seedling, it's really not a stable gene. So I'm going to show you the case of Mylalia purpurata, which is a cross actually, and if it's a cross, there's a high chance that it came from a seed rather than Mary cloning. We Mary clone specific cultivars, but hybrids of the sorts, not really. They usually come from a batch of seedlings. And as you can see, Mylalia purpurata crossed with a semi-alba version looks a little weird. Yes, it is actually missing the petals. I have 3 sepals, I have the lip, but no petals. This is the very first time this orchid bloomed for me this year. Now it's working on a second sheath, so hopefully the next bloom will be full. I'm not super worried because, as I was saying, I'm almost certain this is not a Mary clone, so the gene will not be stable. I am keeping my hopes high that the next flowerings will be a lot better because the flower itself is really pretty. The color combo looked very nice. It was just missing the petals. And in that case, you can see not only the flower was peloric, it was also only 1. So the bloom count was pretty low on my orchid as well. But as I was saying, it was the first time that it bloomed, and I'm hoping for much greater things from it in the future. Bottom line, if you see your first time bloomers being peloric, and typically when they're not Mary clones, but rather this Cattleya crossed with this Cattleya, the Pyloria might not be there forever. The next blooming might be perfectly normal, so don't worry too much about it. However, there is a case in which that trait, being that the genes exist, can linger on. It's not going to manifest every flowering, but it can actually manifest, depending on external factors and stress factors mostly, it can manifest sometimes. So having a pyloric first time bloom, nothing to worry about, but nothing to celebrate either, in my opinion, if you don't like how it looks like. And I'm saying this because I had a case, a Cattleya intermedia variety of Queenie. It had a normal flower and a second flower which was pyloric. The petals will pulled forward, and due to that Pyloria, the orchid actually self-pollinated, so the flower didn't even reach maturity, didn't even open completely, it fell and a seed pod developed. Not something I wanted, personally, and I was hoping the second time that it blooms it will look better, but no, it bloomed again on one flower which was pyloric, so the trait lingered on. But having self-pollinating flowers is worse than having flowers without petals, in my opinion, so yeah, I'm trying to be positive about the purpurata. Bottom line, having not so ideal flowers the first time your orchid blooms is not something to be super worried about. It happens many of the times. Not all orchids will go through it, of course, and I do tend to believe that named varieties, for example, my Bellina is the variety Poncan. I bet you this is a Mary clone. Oh, actually Schroeder did say, yeah. In the description of the Bellina, Schroeder did say it was a Mary clone. So with the Bellina, I have no issue. If you have something like that, I personally believe that the awful first bloom that you have will not linger on. It will correct itself. If you have a crossing, unnamed crossing, and the orchid comes from seed, not a Mary clone, then that's a little bit more tricky. You don't know what you're gonna get. You need to wait for a second or third bloom to be sure that your orchid is in a specific way. And having this in mind, I guess I can understand hybridizers now. Let's say you make a cross and you have this high expectation and you hope you're gonna get this red Cattleya with a white lip. By the way, it exists. The cultivar name is What The, and I find the name to be very suiting. That's 1 in a million or 10 million or something, and that orchid will be cloned, not obtained again. Anyway, back to what I was saying, you can imagine hybridizers expecting this really beautiful result. The first batch looks absolutely horrible, and you're like, okay, maybe it's the first time blooming, maybe I need to wait a little bit more. Second, half of them look decent, but half of them still look bad. You're like, oh, what a fail, but maybe it's not a fail. Let's wait for the third blooming, and then the third time the orchids bloom, you know that some of them will not see the light of day because they just don't look right. So yeah, I guess it's a little pressuring and a little stressful at times. I respect a lot the work of the hybridizers, and the beautiful orchids we have today are their work, and they're just wonderful. I love the species. I also love the hybrids. I have nothing against them, and I can understand the work and the stress behind them. And this first time blooming thing doesn't help as much, does it? Because orchids don't bloom very often. So anyway, that was the video for today. Hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know down below if you have cases in which your orchids bloomed horribly the first time, but then they got better as they aged. I would love to hear your stories. I bet everybody will enjoy your comments. And with that said, you know the drill. Like or dislike this video below. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, tutorials, Q&As, and fun topics of the sorts. And if you'd like YouTube to notify you whenever I upload a new video, just turn on all notifications for my channel. If you're curious about my setup, the pots, the media that I use, again, just expand the description. I have everything listed there. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!